extremely delighted to be here, and I would like in particular to thank Irina Prokhorova for the invitation. Before I start, I would like to situate this paper within a larger research which deals with the notion of transparency as an entry point into the ethics and aesthetics of the neoliberal state, which I do not see as different from the surveillance state. Therefore, I am situating this notion within a regime of hyper-visibility, which shapes both material practices and is shaped by them, and it's also led by current technological developments. So this is a kind of a small case study, very much situated and a spatial reading of the material culture of transparency. But I am trying to, from the spatial reading, to look at more conceptual issues as well. In recent decades, major cities around the world have faced a rapid decline in public space as a result of neoliberal strategies of accelerated urban reorganization, seeking to maximize the commercial value of space. In this context, state-funded projects for the construction of monuments and public plazas are not only rare, but also the object of fierce political contention. This process is particularly visible in contemporary Mexico, a country in which the material conditions for public assembly are perceived to be under threat due to the rapid advancement of commercial enclosures over spaces hitherto considered public. Here, protests for the defense of public space and the definitions of its uses and meaning have gained currency, recalling the fact that, as Judith Butler has recently suggested, when the infrastructures for political assembly are being decimated, the very platform for politics becomes the object around which political mobilization rallies. For Butler, material environments are indeed part and parcel of political action, and they also shape the ways in which we think about the political. What may be described as a recent turn towards reflecting upon the material atmospheres of democracy, to use Bruno Latour's term, follows a broader discussion on the social construction of space and the extent to which space may be a meaningful site of intervention to contest power arrangements. As recently deceased Doring Massey has shown, the analysis of space is particularly relevant when reflecting upon the public, understood both as a sphere of common access and shared goods, and as a site of critical debate about shared problems within a political community. Spatial reflections on politics draw attention to the extent to which the public is never already there, nor does it easily entail equal and even access to everyone. Massey has also argued that space is the dimension of multiplicity, and the spatial arrangements are predisposed towards heterogeneity due to the ever-present differences in positionality and access. This heterogeneity needs not only be recognized, but also understood as having politically dislocating effects. That is, for Massey, public space does not conform to the romantic vision of an emptiness, which enables free and equal access. Public space is necessarily negotiated, sometimes riven with antagonism, and always contoured around the playing of unequal social relations. And this is, in fact, what makes it genuinely public. It is in light of these reflections that a series of controversies around the construction of a new public monument in Mexico City and the subsequent actions to resignify and appropriate this space gain political and scholarly significance. Named the Pillar of Light, this monument consists of a 6-meter wide and over 100-meter tall column made of an onyx-like translucid granite and located in Avenida de la Reforma, a historic avenue at the core of Mexico City, in which cultural and political power converge. This monument was made to celebrate the country's bicentennial anniversary of its independence from Spanish rule and the centennial anniversary of the revolution. However, as you can see, its architectural design is strangely bereft of any references to Mexico history, deploying instead the high modernist aesthetics of a stone screen provision with almost 58,000 digitally controlled LED lights and standing atop of an underground center for digital culture. In this sense, the pillar forms a symbol of an ostensibly post-ideological era in which public art can no longer embrace the sort of heroic narratives and class and ethnic vindications that shaped monumental space in both pre- and post-revolutionary Mexico, most commonly associated, so this is the Center for Digital Culture, and this is post-revolutionary Mexico, you know, they're associated with the murals of Rivera, Orozco, and Siqueiros. Further, the pillar may be said to have accomplished the digital promise to do away with history altogether, both flattening out the past and dematerializing its representation by way of limiting its aesthetic possibilities to a series of algorithmically controlled light displays. Yet this architectural attempt to rewrite Mexico's post-colonial and revolutionary histories in digital codes is also fully imbued in a more direct, if less perceptible, politico-aesthetic operation, described by philosopher Byung-Chul Han as the rise of the transparency society. Perlucidity, or the perniciousness of light, have indeed played a central role in so-called democratic architecture, to the extent that building transparently has been associated with the construction of so-called open societies, a free press, the abolition of secrecy, and open market economies. Here, architectural historians have often described transparency. Architectural historians, however, have described transparency as an expression of a desire for this neoliberal democratic model rather than its actual reflection, leading in some cases to almost unstoppable proliferation of glass buildings without much substantive political change. In recent years, the concept of transparency has achieved much theoretical attention and attained, to quote political scientist Christopher Hood, quasi-religious significance in debates over governance. This notion has indeed become the moral foundation of new forms of neoliberal governmentality, led by the imperatives of self-exposure, positivity, efficiency, and accountability. However, for Han, in a transparent, liquid democracy, quote, politics yields to administrating social needs while leaving the framework of socio-economic relations unchanged, end quote. Moreover, today's transparent societies have been forged by the rise of electronic media and sophisticated strategies of both digital disclosure and surveillance. Therefore, calls for political and governmental transparency are often accompanied by fear of enhanced state control and a perception of diminishing private space. In consequence, critics have argued that today's paradigm of transparency in both politics and architecture is inseparable from rising conspiratorial fears and growing skepticism about the ideas of truth and representation. My reading of the pillar as an index of this elusive political value is reinforced by the fact that this architectural landmark was designed as the foremost urban intervention of a pro-market government heavily invested, firstly, in differentiating itself from Mexico's authoritarian revolutionary past, and secondly, in promoting the idea of digital democracy to enhance trust in the authorities. Yet the morally imbued aesthetics of this column seem a far cry from the history of its construction. The pillar was inaugurated after over a year of delay, therefore not being inaugurated for the bicentennial and centennial anniversaries. And due to demonstrable corruption and mismanagement of public money, it ended up costing more than 80 million US dollars, almost 4 times its original budget. This pillar has thus So this pillar has thus come to symbolize the many failings that have marred contemporary politics in Mexico, embedding a symbol of political dishonesty in the very materiality of the city. After its delayed inauguration in 2012, the column was rapidly renamed in social media the pillar of corruption and humorously equated with a sugary double-layered biscuit known as suavicrema, lending this icon political significance comparable to a thrown-away snack. As I will go on to discuss, however, the history of the political imposition of this space has fueled a series of responses from both artists and social movements that highlight the possibilities and limitations of the political aesthetic paradigm of transparency, as well as the challenges facing those attempting both to appropriate it and to contest it. So this is my first case. I am 132, or yo soy 132. My first example revolves around a movement seeking to foster transparency and democracy through social media, an idea often promoted by Twitter and Facebook enthusiasts who believe in the transformative potential of the ostensibly free flow of information and the rise of a critical public sphere outside mainstream media. In May 2012, 5 months after the inauguration of the pillar, and in the midst of a presidential election campaign, scores of university students belonging to the I Am 132 movement encircled the Pillar of Light as they repeated the rallying cry, "Treachery, money." At first glance, it could seem that in the spirit of French revolutionaries marching towards La Bastille, the students had gone to the monument in order to confront, expose, and ridicule an icon of political ignominy. Yet the internet-savvy middle-class students were truly seeking to appropriate this space and turn it into a symbol of their movement for media freedom. Having witnessed extensive media favoritism towards Enrique Peña Nieto, then presidential candidate of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, and having also been dismissed as agitators rather than proper students by the same candidate and the mainstream media, adherents to the I Am 132 movement started a major media campaign, rejecting the perverse relationship between politics and mainstream media, controlled in Mexico by a duopoly of Televisa and TV Azteca. A democracy, they claim, could not work in a society lacking free and equal access to information. Thus, aside from denouncing the corruption involved in the construction of the pillar, it was a belief in the political transformative possibilities of what they described as transparent information that had led them to identify their movement with the monument and appropriate the potency of light as a political metaphor. Here it says, now it was who gives the news, through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Yet in their enthusiasm for the rapid and seemingly unbounded possibilities of the digital agora, this 21st student movement remained naively uncritical of the extent to which the politics of transparency and public exposure have been accompanied by careful monitoring of people's public opinion, and often aggressive tactics of both surveillance and attack against them. This gloomy control-ridden of the transparent society became all too visible when the surveillance state launched a cyber war against the movement, using so-called Twitter bots, sort of robots, to inundate the movement's hashtags with spam, thus severely circumscribing its public reach. And I'm borrowing this research from computer scientists who analyze similar cases around the world interestingly enough, so you have the non-spam tweets of this young progressive movement in blue, and the spam, which was basically launched by the government. Or in this case, it was really the political party that was running for the presidency, kind of completely flooding the visibility of these hashtags. And it's also happened in Russia on the occasion of the parliamentary elections in 2011. So it's actually quite a widespread strategy today of censorship. Although some nodes of activism associated with this movement still exist, its activity rapidly faded in the aftermath of this election, which has happened a lot with these kind of rapid social movements, you know, that seem incredibly successful at first glance, but they don't develop very lasting links of debate and activism. So at this point, after the election, the government and the mainstream media joined efforts to co-opt the movement's leadership by, on the one hand, hiring one of the leaders as a news broadcaster, and by torturing and imprisoning others, very young students. Yet the students' physical appropriation of the pillar was widely remembered and began to change public perceptions of this space among the critical youth. Indeed, some of the initiatives that I will go on to discuss can be seen as a follow-up to this intervention. The hacking affair. My second case explores the role of art in making visible the voices of minority groups to the point of destabilizing other, more established oppositional voices. In December 2012, artist Ale de la Puente came up with a curatorial project which invited the population at large, particularly young, non-art goers, to devise messages to be written with light onto the column, thus using its advanced lighting system. This artistic project of relational architecture sought to transform the pillar into what new media theorist Lev Manovich has described as an augmented space, but overlaying it with the voices of young people, regardless of their educational backgrounds. Here, the pillar was used both to perform and to allegorize a politics of direct democracy. Yet the constraints on devising one's messages were significant. For them to be transmitted, they needed to be presented as a series of pre-encoded patterns fitting within a 6x12 grid. So already you had to present the image. A technical condition that, just as with many recent new media technologies, constituted a noteworthy restriction on the content of public speech. What is most significant, however, is that those who did participate in this project by sending their messages avoided any mention of politics, publicizing instead their likes and dislikes, their emotional attachments. And while all messages were accompanied by the authors' names, it is interesting that a lot of people ended up proposing, so marriage proposals were particularly popular. The presence of seemingly prosaic messages on an urban icon immediately provoked rumors to emerge that hackers had taken control over the pillar. One of the country's major newspapers published a Twitter message that read, "Names and messages appear tonight on the Pillar of Light. It has been hacked," said a policeman on the site. What seemed to have bothered this paranoid public most was the presumed private use of a very expensive public space and the purported uselessness of the messages. Intellectuals and media commentators alike describe the messages as banal, childish, uneducated, and naff. In New Year's Eve, Grace Quintanilla, the head of the Center for Digital Culture that had hosted this initiative, received a message from the Minister of Culture, who asked her to immediately shut off the pillar and do not turn it on again. No more artistic initiatives have been allowed on the pillar since. And it is important to note that what I'd like to highlight here is that the state's decision to censor this art project was the result of pressure from the educated public, who proved unable to tolerate the spontaneous and kind of playful expressions of a purportedly uneducated public. So here, the digital agora, I would say, reveal the conspicuous inequality of the spaces of political representation and the multiple, often understated obstacles that block public visibility. We often talk about intellectuals as censors, but it could also, in this case, it kind of worked that way. So, the voices of those that, do not have the language to express meaningful public opinions are just de facto kind of wiped out from the visibility of public space. The last example, I entitled the section "The Pillar of Peace," and I would like to close this presentation, therefore, by discussing a very different form of social intervention in the Pillar of Light, which points towards the importance of presence, intimacy, and rituality in public protest. Fully abandoning any attempt to engage with the sophisticated technologies of the column or even embrace its aesthetics of transparency and verticality, this is an intervention in the political topology of the column that attempted to re-symbolize it from the ground up. In April 2013, Javier Sicilia, a Mexican poet whose son was killed by a drug cartel in 2011, and who now leads a movement for justice with justice and dignity, launched a petition to resignify and rescue public space in Mexico by transforming the pillar into a pillar of peace. The resignified monument would become a memorial for the victims of Mexico's current wave of drug-related violence, which as of today number over 150,000 people murdered, and at the very least 30,000 people missing. The government, however, never acknowledged or discussed this initiative, yet Cecilia's movement forged a direct appropriative response regardless, physically intervening in the monument's free access esplanade by placing a series of metal plaques engraved with the names of recent victims of this violence. One plaque reads, "My name is Melchor Flores Hernandez. I am a victim of enforced disappearance. On 21st February 2009, I was abducted by municipal police from Monterrey with police cars, blah, blah, blah. At the age of 31. I am a very joyful person. I used to go cycling and I was a national standard runner. My favorite song is Perfume de Gardenias. Although my greatest dream is to improve as an artist, and in this medium, they know me as the Galactic Cowboy," etc. As a talking object, embodying the voice of somebody who's neither living nor dead, but inhabits the incorporeal condition of being missing or disappeared, this metal plaque seeks to convince the casual reader that Melchor was actually not a troublemaker, but someone who sought to, or someone who had sought out this violent fate, but an ordinary man with an artistic sensibility. Melchor's disappearance is recounted as an injustice, producing much intimate suffering, and begging the intervention of the state to find him or his remains. This plaque, I'm finished. This plaque is also an interpellation to the passerby, carrying an accusation against the police involved, in this case, and prompting the citizenry to act for his return. Laying almost invisible at the base of a vertical giant, this small horizontal plaque of almost the same size as each of the flat and translucent stone slabs that constitute the pillar, also performs a nuanced critique of the politics of visibility and occultation in an allegedly transparent democracy. The metal plaque on which people walk past as they contour the column seems to pose the question of how is it that there is no place in the luminous sphere of visibility produced by this gigantic screen to incorporate the voices of those violently subtracted from the very political community that it was meant to illuminate. What is left of the idea of transparency when it has been fully divorced from political trust and instead has become a blinding flash over a community's political reality. The spatial perspective that I have adopted here does not provide a single answer to these questions. It reminds us, by contrast, that space is, as such, is indeed the sphere of simultaneity and multiplicity. And this is how, as Massey has claimed, quote, it poses the political question of how we're going to live together. With respect to the political and moral ideal of transparency, this spatial inquiry of its material and symbolic instantiations in public space has provided us with a kaleidoscopic vision of the many aspects of political praxis that the ideal of transparency tends to obscure. From surveillance to conspiracy to outright violence, the analysis of the rise of transparency as a form of governmentality in Mexico and the accompanying coupling of politics and the media suggests that democratic transparency not only constitutes a battle over what can be measured, displayed, and performed, but also what can be shut off, made invisible, and covered in a veil of technological complexity. Thank you.
Three questions, and they're meant to open the discussion. In the first place, I had the impression that you had a normative idea of what public spaces should be on a representational regime, but you didn't quite say it. I got the impression, just saying that to provoke an answer, that you felt they would be good if they had a meaning. Yeah? I mean, like the traditional way, so let's say the famous place at Washington with all the names of the victims of the Vietnam War, for example. The space dedicated to something close by there, a monument for the Korean War, can also be positive, but I got the impression that you want these spaces to be semanticized. That's the first question. I mean, maybe I'm completely wrong. I just want to provoke your normative vision of what it should be. And secondly, there's a real question. I mean, you know, I was thinking about the implication. I mean, is there a possibility to symbolically represent transparency? What could that possibly be? I was racking my brain, what could be an emblem of transparency? And then I thought only the absence of any emblem could be an emblem of transparency. Yeah? I mean, would one say perhaps that the only possibility, that column, which I know in Reforma, I mean, I go there quite often at DF, that doesn't represent anything. I mean, you can associate with corruption, you can associate it with the Mexican state being economically potent, showing we can swing that, we can spend that much money on nothing. But it certainly escapes transparency. So the question is, would there be a possibility at all for having an emblem of transparency? Or could you only say, well, we dedicate a space for whatever happens, and that is not an emblem of transparency, but it's a condition for the possibility of transparency. And finally, I was wondering whether the reading of these protest actions, as we have them today, is not behind what is actually happening. I mean, famous example being the Arabic Spring. With electronic media, you very quickly get movements of protest, and then you read them that they want to express something. And I'm asking myself whether this question or this hermeneutic approach, they have to express something, does not miss the point. I mean, it is people all of a sudden being there together, but to say they protest against the state or in favor of something is actually not what is happening. I mean, they're just being there together, but any political reading somehow seems to miss how they use that public space.
Do I have a normative idea of what public space should be? No, and that's why I quoted Marcy, who says that actually, I mean, public space is a space where you can ask the question of what is public space. And I think that's sufficiently convincing for me and for this study. Then, second question. Is there a possibility of representing transparency? I won't give an answer, but I don't have an answer. I think there are many possibilities, and that's what shaped the history of architecture extensively has shaped the history of our imaginaries of light, and each one of them are singular situated representations, therefore both performative and also kind of failed, incomplete, of any ideal, always just a symbol, precisely. And then the idea of multitude, the idea of people coming together without a political program, which equates the Arab Spring with the 3M in Madrid and the Occupy movement. Interestingly enough, I'm working very closely with the discourses, kind of the immanent discourses of these groups. And in the Mexican case, and that's what I put the picture of, now it is now us who gives the news. And they were also, they did have a program, and I didn't reach their political kind of platform that they did. It was the search for free. They didn't have a political and a kind of party politics idea of what their movement was. It was a movement for transparent information. So it was a movement for kind of to be able to escape, to produce or other access routes to dialogue beyond Televisa, beyond TV Azteca. So they had a very specific and actually narrow program, and they came going back to it. There wasn't much. It wasn't like in Syntagma Square in Greece, in which there was a microphone and you could come up with other political projects, with other imaginations of democracy. It was completely, it revolved around that one aspect, and that's why it also vanished so quickly. So that's it. Yeah.
My question is concerns materiality on the square versus the digital aspect. I was really fascinated precisely by the picture of the person with the sign saying that we give the news now. So there seems to be, even as the place is dedicated to digital information and information on the internet, making things more transparent. People seem to think that physical objects, not only their physical presence on the square, but having a physically handwritten sign somehow matters. And again, the plaque, for example. So yeah, you could put on the internet the information about Melchor who disappeared, but instead they want this physical emblem, and some of them are permanent, and some of them, like the handwritten sign, are impermanent. So I was wondering whether you could talk to us a little bit about this physical material.
Yes, materiality is something that has been haunting me with this research, because formerly, I almost chose the monument to begin with because of its materiality. The fact that it's translucent, it's not really transparent. But the original project, it's actually the first image I showed. It is the project, not what got constructed. It's not a picture, it's the architect's kind of how he sold the project. It was much more transparent. It was more like glass-like, onyx-like. Actually, I also have one at the end here. So almost it was the transparency is also the quality of a material. And it's a medium, which becomes invisible. So it's all these, the relationship between the quality of objects and their meaning. It's kind of very fully embedded here. But ultimately, in the process of research, I actually discovered lots of these initiatives in the process of research. And I found that, and going back to the pillar, how it has really become a memorial de facto, kind of almost a grave, a sort of, for these absent corpses. It has proved the most lasting intervention, the most ritually imbued intervention, and interestingly, it's the simplest, it's the less kind of sophisticated in terms of its discourse and in terms of its tradition. It's a tradition of just stamping. It's like, physically appropriating something by means of putting a name, kind of naming. So it's, I don't have much more to say besides that. The fact that it exists in physical, three-dimensional form gives it a different kind of quality, which also reaches more people than the other model, which is very much middle-class centered, and as it is the idea of digital democracy, which in Mexico, in which a country in which not all people have access to internet, is also kind of targeted to a very narrow sector of the population, yeah.
A part of my question will be actually follow-up to what Victoria has just asked. Fascinating on the forced disappearances, on the desaparición forzadas. Is this still going on? And if yes, do you have statistics? Because the question is, how do they choose whose names to put on these signs, on the plaques? And then this is what follows up on Victoria's question. Does it ever have any effect, or is it purely symbolic? And if it ever had any effect, did somebody come and then unscrew the, like, you know, yes, we've done this now, this person has been saved, or we know what happened to them? And as with regards to the transparency and glass, I was wondering how much of this is purely materialistic, environmental friendly, environment friendly and self-sustaining part, purely functional. We are now self-generating solar energy, we are fine, and how much of it is exclusively symbolic?
Oh, okay. Do you mean, what is the environmental aspect? The pillar itself? Oh, it's it's incredibly wasteful. It's not, it's actually, how much energy it wastes every day is not public information, but yeah, I've read. So it's the opposite, actually. But, well, I don't know who chose whose names were put there. I mean, obviously, you couldn't put the name. The original initiative was to write the names of all the known disappeared people in the pillar. And I could just imagine, because I know this movement, that was mostly those that were closest to Cecilia, which is the poet who's really leading this movement, who's traveled all throughout the country, who's gone to the border with the States, and it was probably more, kind of the result of chance. There wasn't really a debate. At least I haven't read anything about who was there and how. All plaques are different, so I also imagine that it was the families that paid for them. And all of them have, different iconography, different fonts, different content. And then the effects. Statistics are also difficult to know. More people, probably 60,000 people are disappearing more than 30,000. That's what research that are closer to the field are saying. Nothing has had any effect. There are other new monuments in the country that have been, for instance, put by the parents of 43 students that were forcibly abducted. And they put a fantastic monument in front of El Caballito, which is one of the most iconic sculptures also in this area of the center. They put right across it a +43 red sign, and it has been tolerated. Basically the strategy of the government has been to tolerate this, but then do nothing afterwards, and there are all these commissions, international commissions doing research, but not very, the entire state is really infiltrated by organized crime, and we don't see any kind of short-term solution.
My question is, actually there are two questions. One is actually the transparency and failure, because of course if it's a monument to mistrust, like in the public perspective, then of course it's actually the failure, all these costs or the ecological aspects of it, which are, this is actually what the monument makes transparent, right? So there's actually failure is also part of this kind of transparency, visibility, that is actually kind of, it's unintended, if you like, consequence, but actually it's within the visibility of this kind of transparency, as kind of a regime of visibility. Right, so that's one question. If that's how would you relate to the kind of failures and these so consequences to the regime of transparency that you are actually describing. And the second question is actually more kind of ethnographic, because of course it's like the question is who is the audience, who actually exactly imagines this, who is actually, I just wonder who actually goes to this digital art museum, and who actually, and how, and in what context people comment, well, this is a, look at this icon, but in fact, look, this is just like people disappearing, or I don't know, like the, so could you
Yes.
talk about kind of context for these kind of statements and
Yes.
visits to this museum and passers-by, or are they people who actually just, it's enough to invoke and like this monument pointed on the horizon, or in, you know, or like talk about this kind of its use on the the snacks kind of covers of certain things like that.
Yeah. In terms of whether transparency can fail or succeed, what I find most interesting about within a regime of hyper-visibility, which I do think exists in relation to the overproduction of pictures and portraits, and you know, what is most interesting is, I feel, is the negotiation between what is visible and what is not visible, rather than whether we can have a fully transparent society or a fully secret society. It's always what are the limits, how are they traced, and how they fluctuate, and how claims to transparency can acquire certain political meaning or the opposite. Because what is most fascinating about transparency is that both the state and the opponents use the same language, both to legitimate themselves and to contest the government. So if you talk to most well-organized, you know, opposition groups or kind of NGOs, everyone wants transparency. So it's really, you have to always embed it in a specific context. Then, in terms of the audience, Mexico City is a city of millions and lots of very curious people. Whatever you do, there will be a public. That's, you know, it doesn't matter. The audience fluctuates a lot, and it fluctuates by thousands of people moving around all the time. This is very central, and it is a very crucial space. The monument is located near the zoo, the main zoo, and in this avenue, which has the Angel of Independence, the Column of Independence, that has most important monuments. It is the imagined core of the city. You know, that continues from the Zócalo, the main plaza, until that. That's the end of it. So actually, the president who commissioned it imagined it as closing down the historical stretch of the avenue. So it was like the closing of history in the kind of Fukuyama sense. And the Center for Digital Culture has made lots of attempts to invite non-art goers. I mean, the Center of Digital Culture is actually is not, the language is not the language of a contemporary art museum. It's much more for a wider public. And they are doing all of this. But of course, with situations in which, you know, you are a 12-year-old adolescent, you put I love tlacoyos in the column, and then it's censored. So it's kind of alienating these publics, and it's now increasingly become this more like connoisseur space for avant-garde artists and more like elite-like.
Thank you so much. May I ask you just a childish question at the end? From the psychological point of view, what do you think? Which was more infuriating for a public? The sheer sum of stolen money or an obliqueness of design? So were the corruption has been forgiven if they presented something more impressive? Sorry for such an answer. I mean, that's of course the design is somehow really just creates quite a lot, of course. So if it were more impressive, traditional, appealing to the public, would be this space of protest created? What do you think?
I think it's stolen money. I mean, in the Mexican, even you go to libraries and you want to buy a book about this, and the seller says, no, we don't sell those books. There is this idea of anger, you know, it's like, it's a mostly poor country, and these millions of.
We know, we have our own case.
Yeah. Also, the original project was 3 times as big. It involves a complete urban intervention, pedestrianization. They made like 1/3 and charged 3 times as much. And some of the people that were involved in this scandal are in prison, but maybe not the big ones. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.